So we will make this program available on the internet after tonight. And finally, for the latest and greatest on the Maltz Museum, please be sure to check out our website, maltzmuseum.org, where we have all of the latest updates, news, and upcoming virtual programs. We do have a series on Cleveland Jewish history throughout the month of June that you all might find very interesting. Details are on our website, maltzmuseum.org. I do want to begin by thanking our partners tonight. Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program are a partner with the museum throughout the summer on many other events, which you can find on our website, as well as CASE's website at case.edu/lifelonglearning. We're also very grateful for the support of congregations Kol Halev, Temple Emmanuel, and Bethel, the Heights Synagogue. I know many of you are joining us tonight from these congregations. We appreciate you being here and for your support. And a very special thank you to Alan Fetterman for bringing this idea to the museum and for your help in coordinating tonight's program. So thank you, Alan. Thank you to all of you once again. And let's get going here. Our mission is to introduce folks to the beauty and diversity of the Jewish heritage in the context of the American experience. And I know that it's been a long time since any of us has been to the Maltz Museum, but I hope some of you remember that our core gallery begins and spends a considerable amount of time on the immigrant roots of the Cleveland Jewish community. These experiences, combined with the Jewish values of welcoming the stranger, seeking justice, and repairing the world, bring us to tonight's panel discussion on the U.S. immigration system. So I'd like to introduce our panelists who are here with us tonight. First up, we have Beth Werlin calling in from DC. Is that right, Beth? Right, from Washington, DC. Beth is the executive director of the American Immigration Council. The council is the nonprofit partner of the American Immigration Lawyers Association and works to strengthen America by shaping how we think and act toward immigrants and immigration. Beth leads the council's efforts toward a more fair and just immigration system that opens its doors to those in need of protection and unleashes the energy and skills that immigrants bring. Beth previously served as the policy director and on the council's legal team. Over her career, she has worked to protect the rights of non-citizens and to ensure that the immigration agencies are held accountable for violations of the law. Beth holds a JD from Boston College Law School and a BA from Tufts University. Thank you for being with us, Beth. Next up, a colleague of Beth's, Crystal Massey, calling in from Las Cruces, New Mexico. Crystal is the volunteer coordinator of the Immigration Justice Campaign at the American Immigration Council. She works with the Justice Campaign team to recruit volunteers and collaborates closely with pilot sites to promote pro bono opportunities and the placement of cases with volunteers. Previously, Beth was the volunteer coordinator of the Dilley Pro Bono Project, where she recruited, organized, and oriented volunteers to the work of the project. Crystal has an MA in Human Rights and Democracy from the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, Flaxo, in Mexico City, and a BA in Spanish Language, Literature, and History from the State University of New York. Thank you, Crystal. Next up, from the Cleveland area, David Leopold is the immigration group leader and partner at Ulmer and Byrne. David's diverse practice focuses on employment and family-based immigration, employer compliance, and complex removal cases, including administrative trials and appeals, and federal court litigation. David is the past president and past general counsel of the Washington, D.C.-based American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, the premier bar association of immigration lawyers and professors in the U.S. David has testified as an expert before the U.S. Congress and has been published in major media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Politico, Mother Jones, and CNN. David holds a BA from the University of Michigan and received his law degree from Case Western Reserve University. Thank you, David. And last but not least, we have Ilana Horowitz-Ratner. Having worked for 40 years as a lawyer, executive coach, and Jewish educator, Ilana Horowitz-Ratner is a founder and an advisor to the Cuyahoga County Immigration Legal Services Fund, which provides pro bono immigration legal services to residents of Northeast Ohio. The fund makes grants to local nonprofit organizations providing expert-free immigration legal services, focusing on cases that maintain family unity, and represents unaccompanied children, DACA youth, and others seeking asylum and safety from persecution and violence. Ilana holds a BA from Goucher and a JD from the New York Law School. thank you, Alana, for being here. And thank you again to all our panelists. And I want to lead off with a question to Beth. Beth, you know, the whole world has changed in the last couple months, and that includes the immigration system. And I was wondering if you could take us back a few months before the pandemic and sort of set the context and give us a high-level overview of the U.S. immigration policy landscape, and what you've been dealing with at AIC in terms of immigration policy at large.
Great, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to you and Alan and the museum for having and hosting this conversation. I just want to say, to start off, I know that so many of us are feeling the weight of the horrific racial violence we've been witnessing in our country right now, and so I'm feeling that weight too, and just want to acknowledge it, and I really appreciate your making space to be here this evening. But so to give you a little bit of context about sort of the immigration policy before we got to this moment in time, you know, I started learning about and studying immigration just after there were pretty draconian immigration laws passed in 1996. And that's the last time we really saw major legislation on immigration. And these laws truly were intended to bar people from coming into the United States, to stay in the United States, even in situations where they had family members. It meant more people were subject to deportation, it opened the door truly to more people being detained and deported. And then a couple of years after that, we saw 9/11. Hundreds of Muslim men rounded up on immigration charges and detained. And these were what I thought were hopefully low points, at least in my career, in terms of how the immigration system was working and sort of were there fair and just solutions for folks. But in the following years, we did see progress. We saw bipartisan attempts to overhaul the immigration laws. We saw the last administration's work to do at the agency level, including adopting programs like DACA, which you mentioned earlier, which is protects young people in the United States. But what we've seen over the past few years, as I'm sure you've all known from the robust media coverage, is just a complete reversal of that progress. We've just seen, sadly, such a wide range of attacks on nearly all aspects of the immigration system. We've seen the ending of DACA. We've seen more indiscriminate enforcement. We've seen, blatantly discriminatory policies like the Muslim ban. We've seen mean-spirited asylum and deportation policies, which I'll say a little bit more in a second. We have the public charge rule, some of you may have heard about, which really attempts to limit who can come to the United States. And then we've seen more discrete policy changes that really bring a lot of uncertainty into how visas are being issued and who's able to come to the United States or stay in the United States. And then the president has made his intentions pretty clear in terms of what he would like to see legislatively, although we haven't seen that happen. He would like to reduce immigration to the country, particularly through immigration through family members. All of that said, I think none of us could have anticipated the devastation that unfolded 2 years ago in the summer of 2018, when we had large-scale families being separated, forcibly separated. These were asylum-seeking families who were separated, moms and dads separated from their children near the border. And we don't talk about it as much these days. We don't hear about it as much, although some of that activity continues, and the trauma for those families goes on. So when I look back at the last few years, I really think the attacks on the refugee and asylum system and our approach to protecting those who are in great need is probably the most egregious of all of the new policies we've seen. We have record low in refugee admissions. We have all sorts of bans for folks arriving at the border. We have people being forced to wait in Mexican border cities for months on end for immigration hearings. We've used Border Patrol officers instead of asylum officers to conduct asylum interviews. So I think you have a little bit of a sense that it's been a rough period. It sort of felt like our country's tradition of immigration really was at this tipping point, and that was all, of course, before we got to 2020.
Thank you. It sounds like a very dire situation before a global pandemic, and now we've all been dealing with this new reality of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And you folks recently put out a white paper on your website all about this topic. I was wondering if you could tell us what's the situation like over the last 2 to 3 months.
Sure. So, I mean, not surprisingly, the pandemic has, like everything else, it's disrupted a lot. Some of it by necessity, unfortunately, some of it not. But truly, the immigration system has been disrupted, practically every aspect of it. Not surprisingly, I think to many, visa processing has really come to a standstill. So that means, the travel restrictions into the United States, consulates being closed overseas, have had a huge impact in the number of people who are able to come into the United States. And then we heard back in April, many of you probably heard about the president's proclamation. It started with a tweet saying that the president intended to temporarily suspend immigration to the United States. He ultimately didn't quite do that, but he did issue an order that suspended entry of certain immigrants, and that are certain types of immigration. And by immigration, I mean permanent status, so you coming in as a permanent resident to the United States, as opposed to someone coming on a short period for work or for some other reason. He issued that order barring for 60 days initially, with the new justification not so much tied to safety and health concerns, but this time really tied to economic and labor needs. Importantly, this order, though, really targets people who are coming based on family relationships, not necessarily people coming for work. So really undermining the justification that was provided. But we saw this deep, deep drop in visas over the last few months, from 600,000 in February to fewer than 50,000 in April. At the border, we saw a similar shutdown, and unfortunately, sadly, that means it's been a shutdown for asylum seekers too. So people coming to seek protection at our border have basically just been expelled by Border Patrol agents without any opportunity to apply for asylum. Between the end of March and the end of April, there were about 20,000 people who were just expelled who came to the border seeking protection. For non-citizens in the United States, it's been a little bit of a different story. There has been less enforcement activity, meaning that there's been less arrests for being undocumented or otherwise being deportable from the United States. But for the people who are already in detention, that has been a focal point for us, and something that is very concerning, because many of those people have remained in detention over the course of the last few months, despite the fact that the government hasn't been shown that it's able to adequately protect the people, both the people in detention, but also the staff that work in the detention facilities. There have been outbreaks of COVID-19 in detention, and there's still over 30,000 people currently in immigration custody today. The challenge on sort of a due process level exists as well, because some of these cases are moving forward in immigration courts, and not necessarily with full remote capacity, not necessarily that the folks in detention are able to consult well with lawyers, if they even have lawyers. So it's been very upsetting, it's been unsafe, it's been a failure of due process. And then lastly, I'll say, with respect to sort of what's happened over the past few months, is that as you probably know, Congress has passed relief packages, but many immigrants and many families that have undocumented members and not undocumented members have been ineligible for much of the relief, including relief under the CARES Act. So the economic strain on immigrant communities has been quite acute. So, just to sort of sum this up, I mean, I think many of us can imagine that some temporary changes to the system are needed in times of emergency. But what we've seen is really, really broad broad changes, not necessarily tailored to the public safety concerns. Some cases feel like they're not even at all responsive to public safety needs. And so, we're definitely living in a scary time, but this feels like truly seems to be a situation of an administration that saw the fear that many of us are experiencing and chose to seize an opportunity in the name of public health and the name of economic need to really advance an agenda that had been spelled out over the last 3.5 years, which was to restrict immigration. And I'm deeply concerned, our organization is deeply concerned about that these restrictions becoming normalized, becoming permanent, and feel that it's really important that we are voicing our opposition to what's happening right now.
Thank you for that overview. There's a lot of ground to cover, and certainly it sounds like a very tough situation has been made much, much worse. David, I'd like to ask you now if you could describe a little bit about Beth's national overview. How have national policies been playing out locally in Northeast Ohio?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in tonight, and thanks for having me. Let me divide it down into a couple of areas. So I'm talking about Ohio, but I'm going to expand it just a little bit beyond Ohio. So in a Cleveland, Cincinnati, Columbus perspective, really in immigration, let's start with detention, the concept of detention. What most of us don't understand is that with respect to immigration, most immigrants who are charged with being here without documents, and again, that's the government's burden of proof. Just because the government says somebody doesn't have documents doesn't mean they don't have documents, or doesn't mean they don't have the right to be in the country. But most of those people end up being detained. A good chunk of them end up being detained. And when I say detained, it's not like a detained in a criminal situation. Remember, this is civil detention. This is not criminal. These people are not being detained because they've committed a crime. Contrary to what most of us believe, being in the country, even without documents, is not a crime in most cases. Sometimes it is, and that's if you've entered illegally after having been deported. But for the most part, it's a civil violation. So we're putting detention, and this is even before COVID, we're putting detention in a civil context. All right, so most of these people end up being detained, and there are the law well before this, back when Beth said she got involved in immigration in 96. In 97, they passed a law which said that there was mandatory detention. People had to be detained without bond in many cases. So in Ohio, we have a lot of people who are detained, when I say detained, it's a nice way of saying locked up. They're locked up in Morrow County. They're locked up down in the Cincinnati area here in the northern part of the state. They use Tiffin, and they use Garfield Heights. They use the Geauga County Jail. And in many cases, these people are just sitting there. So what happened when COVID came in? Well, there were outcries. And then, even not even in the criminal context, there have been outcries to let people out who are not violent, because these jails are petri dishes. They incubate. That's where COVID spreads. And in many cases, people have been let out, but not in immigration. ICE refuses, Immigration and Customs Enforcement has refused to let people go. And in these, I'm talking people who've never committed a crime. These are civil detainees, and they're housed in situations in Ohio where they are exposed to COVID-19. A horrible situation down in Morrow County, that's Mount Gilead. I think it was 47 ICE detainees tested positive. One guy, Acosta, was released, Oscar Lopez Acosta was released. This is a father of 3, I believe. He died several days later. He had been positive and died of COVID-19. So for many immigrants, COVID-19 has been a death sentence. And it's not just in Ohio. This is all over the country. But we're not immune from that. We're not free of it. And it's going on in our jails with your taxpayer dollars. So it's something to really be aware of. And think of it. They're in cramped conditions. There's no hygiene. very little hygiene, no access to doctors, no access to nursing care, or little access to nursing care. This is a petri dish. And this isn't just me talking. A federal judge down in Cincinnati, down in Columbus, actually ordered several people released a couple of weeks ago. And it was in her order that she cited the lack of hygiene, the lack of care, the lack of access, the lack of testing, which is a national problem. So if you magnify that, you have what's going on in immigration detention here in Ohio and across the country. And it shouldn't take a federal judge. It shouldn't take a federal judge to save lives. This should just be a matter, this is a matter of public health, of course, and it's also a moral question. And it shouldn't be Sarah Morrison, the federal judge that let people go. She shouldn't have to reference in her orders how there's no doctors and how there's no nursing care and how there's no hygiene. So that's what's going on in Ohio and throughout the country when it comes to immigration detention. When it comes to general immigration enforcement, checking companies or arresting people who are alleged to be undocumented, or stopping people, that's going on. That hasn't stopped. That is going on in Ohio and across the country. So ICE has not let up at all. And again, remember, we're talking about civil enforcement. We're not talking about criminal enforcement. We're talking about civil enforcement. So they have not stepped back a bit and said, okay, well, we get it. There's COVID-19. We don't want to keep people in small spaces. We don't want to prioritize. Maybe we should be going after people who are dangerous to the community rather than some mother who doesn't have documents that's taking care of kids. There's been no prioritization at all. It's business as usual for immigration and customs enforcement. Now, the other side of immigration is also the benefits side, and that's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Now, across the country, the offices closed down for the most part. And okay, that's a reasonable move, right, to close down those offices. But CIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, has made some accommodation, but nothing compared to what they ought to be doing in terms of keeping immigration benefits moving forward. And when I say immigration benefits, I'm talking about husbands and wives husbands and wives who've been married and one needs a green card, families who need to reunify, children who need to be placed in homes or with their parents or given a green card because they've been subject to abuse, women who've suffered domestic violence and need to be given appropriate documentation. That has also been put on hold, number one. And then number two, people whose visas are expiring. People, for example, who are working at some of the great hospitals that we have in here in Cleveland are sitting there during the day, and I have clients like this. During the day, they're on the front lines saving lives. They're putting themselves at risk. They may die because they get COVID-19 because they've been exposed, and they're attending to people. Have their visas been automatically extended? Has their stay in the United States been automatically extended? Have they been given any accommodation by immigration? No. This administration has done nothing. And these are people on the front lines. And tomorrow, speaking of people on the front lines, tune in at 10 o'clock in the morning. The Supreme Court of the United States most likely will be making a decision, maybe not, but will be making a decision on DACA. You all know about DACA, which protects the young dreamers. Okay, and a lot of those young dreamers are on the front lines in healthcare, are on the front lines in the industries that are bringing food to our table, in agriculture and in service industries. And now the administration wants to take away DACA, and the Supreme Court may very well let them do that tomorrow and start deporting youth. This is the priority. And against that, taking it out of Ohio, we have an administration that has diverted $18 million out of the budget to build a wall, out of the defense budget and out of National Guard. $3 million of that $3 million has been targeted toward painting that wall black. all in the middle of a COVID crisis, so that it's hot, so that people burn themselves when they try to climb the wall. That's the priority. That's what's going on right now. Okay, and so on the benefit side, that's what we see. Beth mentioned visa restrictions. People can't come in. Think about this. Think about your professional here in the United States, right? And you happen to be from Sweden. You're here on a visa. You're doing cutting-edge research at university hospitals. You can't go home to visit your ailing mother or father, because if you do, you're barred from coming back here, because if you've been in the Schengen region, which includes Sweden, within the previous 14 days, you can't come back. And there's really no exception that covers even a healthcare worker in most cases. So that's what's going on. The immigration restrictions are, and I think Beth pointed this out, not only is this government not taking the opportunity to help people, immigrants who are essential workers, but they're making it worse. The president, for example, said that we have to have, he used the defense production, I believe it was defense production, whatever, to keep the meatpacking plants open, whatever rule he used, executive order. You know who's in those meatpacking plants are a huge amount of undocumented and documented immigrants working, making the beef, making the pork that comes to the table. The pork, I know, doesn't come to a lot of tables here, but beef does, okay? And that's who's making it. And those folks are in hotbeds. Those meatpacking plants are hotbeds of COVID-19. So on the one hand, you can't close those meatpacking plants, says the president, because they are essential workers. This is an essential job. On the other hand, let's keep throwing these people out, because we got to get rid of them in the middle of a crisis. So that's the kind of policy we're dealing with. And I'm gonna stop there. I would be more than happy, of course, to answer any questions you guys might have.
Thank you, David. That was terrifying and illuminating, and I could feel the energy that you're bringing to this issue. And Beth, I can feel the emotion from you both. And I want to shift to Alana now and ask you, Alana, as a citizen who is not professionally involved in this work, clearly what's been going on and the emotion and the passion that we've been hearing from David and Beth has caused you to act and to get involved in this work. I was wondering if you would tell us how you came to this work recently and some of the things that you've been involved in this area.
Thank you, Ben, and it's a privilege to be here with everybody. So I had been a practicing family law lawyer for over 25 years. I had retired 15 or 20 years ago. And after the November 2016 election, in about a week after, I couldn't sit still anymore, and I reactivated my law license, and I called 2 places to find out if I could volunteer and I ended up being interviewed and volunteering in the pro bono immigration law department at Migration and Refugee Services of the Catholic Charities, the Diocese of Cleveland. And I started working there in January of 2017. The first thing they did was send me with a paralegal to immigration court on the 13th floor of the federal building, where I was interviewing unaccompanied minors with an interpreter. The kids came from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala primarily. And the interviews were about their experiences of persecution and violence, rape, and threats of murder. I also conducted asylum and refugee intake interviews at the Immigration Law Department of Catholic Charities and learned the details of these traumatic persecution and violence experiences. I interviewed some teenage girls who were pregnant during the interviews with me following violent rapes. Some of the interviewees had these children and many adults had witnessed the murder, rape, and dismemberment of family members. I also, while I was in immigration court, I learned that most of the people seeking asylum, whether they were children or adults, had no access to immigration lawyers. Unlike what goes on in the criminal justice system, where you have a right to a lawyer, in the immigration system, there is no right to a lawyer. I also learned that if you're seeking asylum and you have an immigration lawyer, you are 10 times more likely to succeed with your asylum case. And that means that if you have an asylum case and you have an immigration lawyer who's an expert in this work, you have over a 70% chance of having asylum granted and being able to remain in the United States. And if you don't have an expert immigration lawyer, then your chances of succeeding with your asylum claim are under 20%. So as Beth had indicated earlier, the issue of due process, it's almost a no-brainer, and that's sort of what hit me after doing this volunteer work for about 1.5 years and having discussions with the immigration professionals in the office where I was working. I learned that in the United States, fewer than 20% of asylum seekers have immigration lawyers, and for those people that Beth referenced waiting in Mexico, less than 2% have immigration lawyers. So a group of, after I learned all this and spoke with a number of people, including family members, friends, and colleagues, a group of Northeast Ohio concerned citizens established what's called the Cuyahoga County Immigration Legal Services Fund. It's housed at the Cleveland Foundation. It has almost $1 million in it. And the fund provides free expert immigration lawyers who work for Catholic Charities and legal aid. So the fund basically makes sure that people in need in our Northeast Ohio community who need immigration lawyer defense in order to pursue their asylum claims can have the lawyers. And right now, ever since these people started being detained, as referenced by Beth and David, right now the funding is primarily for people seeking asylum who are in jails in, as David referenced, primarily in Geauga, is where most of the work from the fund is happening. So that's what I've been doing for the last, since January of 2017.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Alana. I know that you've also traveled to the border. In addition to the work that you just described here locally, you and David traveled to the El Paso Juarez area in September 2019, is that right?
Yes.
And you met, among other people, Crystal. So I'd like Alana and David to tell us about the trip and tell us how you came to meet Crystal. Alana, go ahead.
Okay. So over Labor Day weekend, there are a number of people on this call who were also on the trip. It was an immersion trip, a 3-day immersion trip sponsored by the Diocese of Cleveland, the Catholic Diocese of Cleveland. It was a mixed group of Catholics and Jews. We've become very close. We love each other. We meet now virtually, but we stay connected every month or so. We've entertained each other in each other's homes before COVID started, and we're continuing with our activism. We learned that the majority of asylum seekers are parents and children, over 90%. We kept encountering the same narrative, and one that we're familiar with, one that demonizes a particular people. And in this case, it's brown people primarily from Central America. It's a hateful and misleading narrative, and a narrative that what we saw firsthand criminalizes innocent children and their families. So one of the things I saw, which was that we all saw, that was the most distressing of the entire 3-day trip, was that people arrived at the U.S. border. Many people arrived crossing a footbridge from Mexico to the United States, from Juarez to El Paso in this case. And, if you have an asylum claim, you are legal, contrary to what the administration says. You are legal and you don't have documents. That's what asylum looks like. There are no documents. And what you do, because you have a human right, an international right to seek safety and refuge, is you cross the border, however you can get there, and then you go to someone who is in a position to help you, and you say, I am being persecuted, I want to claim asylum. So what our government has now done, which we were shocked to see, was that they've put up barbed wire barricades 40 or 50 feet in front of the United States border, so that in effect prevents someone who's seeking asylum from claiming asylum, because you cannot get to the border. And that was the most distressing thing that we saw. The other thing we did was we visited a shelter where families and children who used to be able to get to the border, Beth and Crystal will speak to what's going on now, but in September of 2019, there were people in the shelter, basically families with young children in diapers and bottles, and they arrive with nothing. They arrive with the clothes that they've been wearing for months, and there's no indoor plumbing. It's a warehouse. There are outdoor showers and toilets. And we certainly witnessed firsthand the bravery and commitment of 60s-like warriors, the priests and brothers and sisters and volunteers who all staff the shelter. I can tell the story about the one family, but I don't want to, I see we're running out of time. I think I'll stop there. David, do you want to add anything?
No, I really want to hear from Crystal, but I will say that the difference is, I think back to September of 2019, and as horrible as things were, and I think Crystal can probably elaborate on what that was like better than I can. As horrible as things were at that point, the law was still at least arguably a frame of reference. In other words, the government, the United States government, the administration, they did horrible things, but at least they referred to the law, right? They tried to rationalize it in the context of the law as is written. With COVID-19, they've now taken the opportunity to throw the law completely out, and they're stopping people at the border saying it's a health issue, which of course there is a health issue, but not a health issue that requires that we suspend all of our law, especially our law, which the tradition of this country, the last time I checked, was as a haven for refugees. I think that's how the first people supposedly came here. But so anyway, that's what goes through my mind when I think about this now. Ben, but I kind of want to hear from Crystal, because I think she's been on the front lines down there and can tell us what it was like then, but of course, more importantly, what it's like right now.
Yeah, Crystal, please go ahead. And thank you, David and Alana. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, I wanted to just say that when people come to the border on trips like the one that Alana and David came on, and then I see that another friend of mine is on this call as well, who came to the border about 2 months after they were here in November. And it had changed, the situation on the ground had changed radically just by then. One of the things that happened about 3 weeks after Alana and David were here is that large numbers of people in certain specific regions of Mexico started fleeing to ask for asylum because of a horrific increase in violence. Most of the people who
Crystal.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I can say one thing while you're trying to get her back.
Yeah.
Just to point out the obvious, that the same borders that were open to our families coming through Ellis Island and to the millions of Russian Jews that we helped bring 30 years ago, these are the borders that have now been closed tight to asylum seekers. So they are us and we are them.
I think Crystal's back. She's on mute.
I'm looking for her now. Beth, would you be able to get in touch with her? Is she back?
She's on. She's there, but there's a mute. She's on mute.
Hold on. Sorry, folks.
Crystal, wave so I can see you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Alana, thank you for that point. That's an excellent point. And Crystal, go ahead.
We had a friend of mine in Juarez, actually Cristina, who was somebody that Ilana and David had met, who is a fellow human rights advocate and who has been working to help people who are trapped in northern Mexico and better their situation and the situation at the shelters. She called me and said, hey, we've got a bunch of people coming from this region of Mexico that you know well, and they're refusing to leave the street and go to the shelters. And so we were all of a sudden in a situation where I went down because she had reported that there were over 40 people waiting in the street. And by the time I got there were over 100. And by the end of that day, there were over 200, all coming from 3 specific states in the state of Mexico, and all for very similar reasons. And it was all families. And so if you listen to the news, if you go back and listen to the news, you'll hear repeatedly as reporters talk about Remain in Mexico or the migrant protection protocols, that Mexicans are not part of that. Mexicans are not forced to wait in Mexico as part of the migrant protection protocols, which is accurate. However, the people coming from...
Ooh, looks like Crystal has a bad connection.
The people coming from the other Central American countries are being forced to wait in Mexico. And what we saw happening was that after they'd been turned loose by the border guards made sure to take away their shoelaces in detention, in this temporary detention. And then they were released in Juarez. And the gangs in Juarez then would know who to target, because the people without shoelaces would be the people that they would target. I mean, it was crazy.
Yeah, and that's...
Yes.
Crystal, you're back?
Yes. So what Ilana was just describing is one of the things that my friend Christine has also worked with, was just how this came to her attention. So some of the biggest things that we've seen changing on the ground are the numbers of people being blocked. At different points, we've had over 3,000 people who are Mexican asylum seekers being forced to wait in their country of origin. And our Border Patrol officers are telling them if they want to be processed, they have to go get on a list that is being held by the government that they are fleeing. We had a growing tent city. We have growing tent cities at all of the ports of entries in Juarez, one of which was in existence from mid-September until just after what's known as Three Kings Day in Mexico in January. And it was just 3 days before the president of Mexico was going to come to town, and they cleaned up the street. They literally came in with the Mexican military, with large garbage trucks, and all of these gifts that have been given to children throughout the holidays in the December time, and that Three Kings Day were taken from them. The tents that they'd been living in for months that were all donated from volunteers were thrown away in front of them as they stood with volunteers literally running to the closest store to buy garbage bags so that people would have something to throw their most precious valuables in. And some people who had managed to keep documents and things that would have been of value for an asylum case lost them in that moment as the Mexican government came in and cleaned up a camp of Mexicans that we had refused to process and refused to recognize their right to ask us for asylum. We have had pastors. Now with COVID, one of the biggest changes we're seeing is that it's mostly pastors that run the shelters in Juarez. And these pastors that have what are called B1, B2 visas, which allow them to travel up to 30 miles across the border and for very short periods of time, and who have regularly come back and forth to get supplies, to receive supplies from people in the US who are collecting them for the people that are being sheltered there in migrant protection protocols, because while we force people to be there, there are no UNHCR camps, there are no Mexican, there's one, let me correct myself, there's one shelter run by the Mexican government that holds less than 2,000 people, while we have over 10,000 who are being forced to stay in Juarez. And then we have approximately over 3,000 Mexicans who are waiting there right now. So it's mostly pastors and the civil community that have stepped up to try to help with the situation. And many of these Mexicans who have been so involved in this struggle, who have been able to come back and forth, they're now being blocked from even stepping foot on the bridge themselves, and their paperwork is being ignored and denied. And so a lot of people from the United States side are going in and taking supplies to the different shelters. There have been several cases of people who run shelters who have just given up and committed suicide. There are new levels of desperation in a way that we have never seen before, because people who have been waiting and in line for a year for a court date in El Paso and have done everything correctly, even under these new migrant protection protocols that were scheduled for court dates over the past month and in the coming month, those court dates have now been canceled with no date that's in the foreseeable future, and no respect for the time that they have waited. They are just being told, you will be assigned a new court date at some time. And the only way that they're being told that they can find out when that court date is to come physically to a bridge between Juarez and El Paso on a specific date at a specific time to wait in line to try to find out what's going on, which is again a moment when they are extremely vulnerable because they are being targeted by gangs. The gang violence in Juarez is through the roof. It was already through the roof before COVID. And now, in addition to all of these other things, the detention centers, which are still business as usual, and where there are active cases of COVID, and they continue to transfer people from a detention center with an active case of COVID to a detention center without active cases of COVID. These types of things are happening regularly as well. Then they're deporting people back to their countries of origin. They're deporting people to these shelters in northern Mexico where people are waiting in migrant protection protocols who are asylum seekers. And the shelters are just at a loss at this point of how to respond. And many shelters are coming up with a room that is for people that they know have COVID, another house where they're sending people who might have been exposed and having them wait. And then they're also having the areas where they believe that everybody is safe and that there won't be contagion. It has been absolutely disastrous, but it is again the civil community on both sides that are keeping people alive and who are in charge of all of the response at this point. There's no international response and there's no governmental response in any meaningful way to help the people in this situation. The kidnappings are up across the board in all of the northern cities in Mexico. And there are even horrific cases of people who were scheduled for what's called a non-refoulement interview, which would be a situation when they could show that they'd been tortured in Mexico. Their attorneys had worked hard from these nonprofits locally to get them scheduled for these interviews, and then those have been taken away as well. So even people that we know have been tortured by cartels in Mexico after we have put them into migrant protection protocols are being forced to stay there, and we are no longer proceeding with those interviews either. It does continue to be mostly families, absolutely incredible parents who, if any of you ever saw the movie Life is Beautiful, the thing that has most impressed me for over a decade working with asylum seekers is the number of parents who manage to keep their children emotionally protected through all of this horror and all of the wrenches in the systems that we throw at them. And no matter how impossible we are making these situations, we still see parents who have managed to keep their children as safe as it is possible for a human being to keep a child safe. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Crystal. You've gave us a lot to think about. I just want to give a quick another housekeeping note. This will go past 8. We started a little bit late, so we want to continue the discussion so we get some questions in from the audience. Crystal, just one thing that you said there at the end, the necessity for parents to shelter their children emotionally really just further underscores how tragic and terrible it is that these families are oftentimes being separated, and now that's really just a horrible situation. I gotta say, the three of you, the four of you have painted a very grim picture, right? It is a very grim situation. And we got our first question in who asked the same question I was going to ask you next anyway. My friend Abby Brule is the new director of the Cleveland office for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, one of the 9 official refugee resettlement agencies in the U.S. Abby wants to know, and Abby, I'm paraphrasing, with the suspension of resettlement programs, the suspension of visas, and several other examples of the sort of bureaucratic catch-22 nowhere land that is being set up at every corner. And Crystal, you sort of alluded to the lack of any governmental response, and that civilians, average, pastors and individual human beings are leading the charge, and certainly organizations like the AIC are leading the charge. Abby wants to know, what can we do to address these issues? And certainly as individuals in Northeast Ohio, which may seem very far from the southern border geographically, what can we do? And I was wondering if you could describe some of the things that AIC does that folks might be able to get involved in. Crystal or Beth, I guess, Beth, let's maybe turn it over to you first.
Great, thank you so much. No, that's a great question. It is a bit overwhelming, and I apologize that the first, most of the discussion so far has felt a little bit doom and gloom, but we do look for those glimmers of hope, and I'd love Crystal to talk a little bit more about the ways that individuals have volunteered and stepped up and made real differences. Alana talked about the rate of what having a lawyer means to your case and the impact a person can have, and it's real, it's significant, and it's important. At the council, we have the Immigration Justice Campaign that Crystal works on, which she'll say a little bit more about, but we also do other law and policy work, systemic change work, and litigation is one of the tools that we bring. Litigation has been, well, it hasn't fixed all of our problems the past few years. It's been a little bit of thank you for litigation, because it has stopped some of the worst. It's slowed down certain things from going into effect, even if ultimately they did later. Sometimes in that process, they were fixed, they were improved. It muted the impact of how certain policies have been rolled out. So having that tool of litigation, knowing that there are lawyers at our organization and others, private lawyers who are willing to go to court at every turn and challenge unlawful policies, has been critically important and useful. The other thing I can say is, we spend a lot of time, we used to, before this administration, we spent a lot of time in our policy group sort of doing advocacy and going to the agency and trying to work out problems. We don't have a lot of opportunities to do that, and instead we really shifted to education. It's so important that we're documenting, we're exposing, we're showing what's happening, we're explaining it, we're breaking it down. We put out a variety of research papers and short papers and blogs that are really intended to make sure people are learning, they're paying attention. And I can't say enough about taking advantage of the fact sheets we have, of the daily blog that we put out called Immigration Impact, that tries to sort of in 500 to 700 words sort of keep you updated on the biggest issues that are coming down the pike in the immigration space. It's so important that more people are learning about the immigration system. It's just not an issue that everybody was following day in and day out, and it's really taken center stage over the past few years. And that's, when you look for silver lining, it's that there are more people interested in learning, educating themselves, pushing back, volunteering, getting involved. It really started at the beginning of the Trump administration with the travel ban and lawyers rushing to the airports and people contacting us and saying, I want to be part of this, I want to help. And how have we've tried to capitalize on that interest in volunteerism. Crystal, if you want to say a little more, I'd love for you to share about ways people engage with your program.
Unmute.
She's on mute.
Sorry about that. Go ahead,
There
Crystal.
we go. Oh, no worries. My husband's a musician. If you hear fiddles in the background, they're about to go do a driveway serenade, just one of the things that they do around here. The fact sheets that Beth just mentioned also include state fact sheets. And there's an Ohio fact sheet that I know is going to be updated in just a few weeks. And that's, I think, would be of particular interest to people in your region. With the Justice Campaign, which is part of the American Immigration Council, and you can find more information about the work we do at immigrationjustice.us. What we do is we work with nonprofit organizations all over the country. So if there's a nonprofit that's already working, for example, at Otay Mesa, which was the place where I submitted that they had their first COVID-19 death, which we believe to have been a completely unnecessary death. People have been pushing for over a month for people to be released from that detention facility. We work with the Immigration Justice Project on the ground there. That is an incredible group that has lawyers that are working with them and people who are doing work on the ground. But then they take on all that they can and with all of their local volunteers, and there's still a huge need. In detention centers around the country, only 14% of people, even pre-COVID-19, there was only 14% of people that had access to an attorney, and now it is significantly less. And so what we're able to do is by utilizing volunteers who sign up, whether they be attorneys or speakers of a second language who we can then match with English-only attorneys so that attorneys can take on that work. We have training materials that are available to attorneys and also mentors.
We lose Crystal again.
Yeah.
Can I add a couple of things?
Go ahead.
While we lost Crystal. So I will say that I've been practicing immigration law for a number of years, more than I care to admit. And I couldn't have done it. I can't do it without AIC. And I'm not, I used to be on their board, but I'm not now. I don't have any personal interest in, but it's an amazing organization. And particularly those of you on this call, obviously you have an interest. And so you're probably getting into conversations about immigration. I see Crystal's back, so I'll be real quick. It is an amazing resource for facts, whether it's immigration and crime, whether it's immigration and education, immigration and welfare, all the things that you hear, immigrants steal, immigrants do this. Go to the AIC website if you want the facts, and it's facts that are respected across the board. It's not propaganda, they are facts. And the other thing is, they are a nonprofit, and so they can use money. So feel free to give. I'm not here to fundraise, but as long as we're talking about it. Anyway, go to Crystal.
Crystal, did you have something you wanted to continue?
One more thing, I am here in part to recruit. If anyone is looking for a way to step up and take action, we have advocacy actions that people can take on, whether if you are a non-attorney and an English-only speaker, we can still talk with you about important advocacy that is happening today that might interest you. If you speak a second language, we have needed over 50 languages just this past year for the variety of people who are detained and to facilitate attorneys who are solo practitioners and often retirees being able to take this on. And especially if you're an attorney, we can always use you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you are interested in volunteering.
And Crystal, can you just say a little bit about, in terms of this is all remote, right now it's all remote?
Oh yes, it's all remote. We don't want anyone stepping foot into a detention center right now. You would not be asked to travel in any way. And I can always talk to people about what it's like to make a three-way phone call and help talk you through that. All of the work opportunities that we have now, right now, are 100% remote. Thanks.
Thank you, Crystal and David and Beth, for that input. And Alana, it sounds like the way that you got involved in this was just to participate, as in providing your pro bono services. And certainly not everyone needs to be a lawyer to get involved, but it sounds like that might be an option for a lot of folks on the call. And I would just say that, my email is in the chat. Again, if anyone wants to get in touch with our speakers, send me an email and I'd be happy to connect.
Well, and Ben, you're handing out a Cleveland area immigration refugee resource guide that has a whole list of organizations in our area where lawyers and non-lawyers, just anybody who wants to get involved can get involved.
Right.
Catholic Charities, certainly making donations to the fund, Global Cleveland, the Greater Cleveland Immigrant Support Network, HOLA, Refugee Response, the Thomas Jefferson International Newcomers Academy, and US Together, all Northeast Ohio organizations. And we'll be sending out, Ben will be sending out that information to you.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that, Alana. I have, folks, do you have time for one more question? I do have one more question from Kobe Picker, who is a young leader in the community, part of the Bend the Arc initiative. Kobe wants to know about your perspective on reducing funding to ICE and the CBP. Would that improve the immigration landscape? And are there other specific policy changes that you advocate for? It's an open question.
Yeah, I mean, when we have this paper that talks about the funding. It's a short fact sheet, if you're interested, that really shows how funding for immigration enforcement has just skyrocketed over the past, really over the past 15 years. But I mean, you just see these amazing leaps in millions and millions and millions of dollars being targeted at, I mean, detention is so expensive. We're talking about, $200 a day to be detaining people. So expensive. I think, what's really interesting is that you don't see the commensurate amount of resources being put into adjudication. So immigration court systems are backlogged. There's no, representation for people. So it's sort of like they put all this money into enforcement, but then didn't back it up with, how do we then process people once they're even in the system? So it's outrageous. I don't think, that's going to solve all of our problems, but certainly, appropriations is a place that we pay a lot of attention to, and how Congress is spending money. Concerned about it for sure.
If I could follow that up a little bit, I agree with what Beth said, but look, there's one day when we have a president who will sign a bill and we have a Congress that will pass a bill, we need to have a complete overhaul of the system, the immigration system. Beth mentioned ICE, and yeah, ICE has got way too much money for the mission that it has, and it has all that money because it has I would think that there's a couple of things there. There's a detention mandate. They have to detain 30,000 people a night by statute, which is ridiculous. But we can go into that later. The other thing is the immigration courts. Beth mentioned the immigration courts. Understand, people, that there is no independent immigration court in this country. It's all law enforcement. So when somebody goes to an immigration court, and I'm using air quotes, sorry, they're going to the Department of Justice. They're going to a prosecutor. The immigration judge, for all intents and purposes, is a prosecutor. He or she is a designee legally of the Attorney General. So they're all working for Bill Barr right now, or before that, Jeff Sessions. And that's how they come at these cases. So there's no independent review in immigration court. And so the first time an immigrant has any kind of independent review is when she or he is before the Court of Appeals, the Federal Circuit. And at that point, the law is such that the judges have to defer to what happened before the immigration court. I'm not going to get into the technicalities, but it's very difficult to reverse those cases, especially on issues like discretion, decision making. So the point is that we have to have a complete overhaul of enforcement. We should not be focused on enforcing the law against workers. We should be enforcing the law against companies that exploit workers. And if you enforce the law against companies that exploit workers, you're not going to have and at the same time, you fix the immigration system with a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented people. You're not going to have, quote unquote, undocumented immigration. If you go after the companies that are exploiting them, that makes a lot more sense. For example, the golf courses that exploit undocumented workers and use them for cheap pay. You have two kinds of exploitation in this country. Two kinds of employers when it comes to undocumented workers in this country. You have the exploitive ones, the ones that have a choice. You can hire somebody to groom your golf course and pay them regular wages, or you can go on the cheap and really exploit some poor people from Guatemala or Mexico or some other place. But then you have industries that don't have a choice. Agriculture comes to mind, number one. 50% of the agriculture is undocumented, 50%. They clearly need the labor. So if we reform the system such that it meets our economic needs, we aren't going to have an undocumented population. And if you change the enforcement focus from locking up mothers and fathers and grandmothers to locking up bad actor employers, and I'm not talking about all employers who employ undocumented workers. Some employers, like I just said, don't have a choice. I'm talking about the bad actors, the exploitive ones. That's where the focus ought to be. It ought to be a labor law enforcement. Just like we guard workers' rights in this country, we ought to be guarding the rights of all workers. And then, with immigration reform, real immigration reform, you are not going to have an undocumented population in the future, also assuming we have a well-designated temporary worker program that, ebbs and flows with economic need.
Thank you, David. We did have one last question about how to join some of AIC's missions on the ground, which I understand have been suspended until further, I'm guessing are suspended for now. So we'll send some information along about past trips to the group if you have anything.
Yes, and if people are interested in future trips, we are actively working with our on-the-ground partners for some of the types of trips people can do in the future. And so they should feel free to reach out to me.
Great. Thank you, Crystal. I think we're at a good stopping point. I want to say thank you again to our four panelists, Beth Werlen and Crystal Massey from the American Immigration Council, David Leopold from Ulmer & Byrne, and Alana Horowitz-Ratner, a co-founder of the Cuyahoga County Immigration Legal Services Fund, among many other things. Thank you all for being here. We will send a follow-up email with a number of resources that the list just keeps growing. And my email is in the chat box. You all should be able to contact me if you want to get connected to our panelists. I'm going to go ahead and say they'd be happy to get in touch with you.
Absolutely.
So without any final closing thoughts or comments, we'll say goodnight to everybody and thank you all for being here. Please check our website for upcoming programs. And sorry, before we hang up, thank you again to Case Western Reserve Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, Congregations Kohalev, Temple Emmanuel, and Bethel, the Heights Synagogue, and to everybody who assisted in putting this together. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.